communicators. Welcome to the CommClub chat. We have a special episode for you today. We've teamed up with the Law and Disorder Club for a discussion about de-escalation. My co-host today is Christine Ducote, president of the Law and Disorder Club. Hi, Christine.
Hello, good morning.
And we've teamed up in part because communication skills are an incredibly important part for anyone thinking of the field of criminal justice as a career. And quite frankly, we could all use better communication skills in our day-to-day interactions. And we have a special guest speaker with us today, Mr. Gary Noesner. Gary had a 30-year career as an investigator, instructor, and negotiator with the FBI. When he retired in 2003, he was the chief of the FBI's Crisis Negotiation Unit Critical Incident Response Group, the first person to hold that position. He's also the author of Stalling for Time, My Life as an FBI Hostage Negotiator. So I think he's well-positioned to speak to the importance of de-escalation in law enforcement and beyond. Welcome, Gary. Thanks for your time today.
Well, good morning. I'm happy to be here.
So in communication, you always make sure you're all starting on the same page. So the definition of de-escalation in the dictionary is reduction of the intensity of a conflict or a potentially violent situation. So, Gary, when you're thinking about de-escalation, what comes to mind, and what should we really be thinking about in terms of diffusing a situation?
The item that you're trying to de-escalate is obviously a conflict or an argument, a strong disagreement. And it's important to realize that it generally takes two people to keep a strong disagreement in continuing. So if you remember that by controlling your own emotions as a person, you can have a very positive effect on de-escalation. So self-control is the very first description out of my mouth when I'm training negotiators. And the basic premise is if you can't control your own emotions, how can you begin to think that you're going to influence someone else in a positive way? So I think if you look at it that way, that before we can really move to substantive problem solving and discuss an issue in a thoughtful and respectful way, we first have to get beyond the hurdle of strong anger and frustration. And, there's a number of ways of doing that by showing respect and being genuine and investing the time and listening to someone else. But the thought of any communicator, whether you be in law enforcement or just in life in general, is to first project a calm, respectful demeanor that will help facilitate moving the discussion in the direction that you want. Okay,
so there's a couple of things in that really appeal to me. So the calm approach. So let's say law enforcement specifically, how do they, quote unquote, holster their emotions when, a situation, or how do they change the escalating conflict or influence it when, let's say, it's been very violent or very, it's a car chase or whatever it is that's going on that's kind of escalated beyond a normal interaction? How do they begin to turn the tide of that emotion?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult. And as you suggest, you're in a car chase or you're running through a backyard, jumping over fences, chasing an armed robber, right, or whatever it might be. It's hard now to put all of that adrenaline back in its place and, take a couple deep breaths and move on when you're kind of in a fight or flight mode to begin with.
Yeah.
But, experienced, effective law enforcement officers have learned how to compartmentalize those emotions. It's akin to a trauma surgeon. If the normal person were to see a horrendous accident where perhaps somebody's legs had been cut off, we would probably respond in a pretty emotional, perhaps illogical, panicky way. What do I do? And this is terrible. Where a trauma surgeon, it's not that they don't feel those emotions. They put them aside and focus on what has to be done immediately to save this life. So in the same context, a police officer would say, okay, I realize now I have to kind of stay in a mode that serves the goal of de-escalation rather than, behave in a manner that only makes it worse. And there obviously is a whole spectrum of police officers who do this naturally and effectively and
right,
or have learned it, and there's police officers who are just terrible at it, and they just don't have the right personality skills. It always strikes me as amazing that and I'm not criticizing it, but the amount of hours that law enforcement officers expend in training with weapons and shooting.
Right.
And that's critical and it's important. But if you compare that to the amount of time devoted to communication skills, it pales in comparison. It's minuscule. And that shows sort of a general lack of appreciation that tool, that communication tool that you have, will probably be used infinitely more times. Most police officers never discharge their weapons. I mean, I had 30 years in the FBI. I never had to discharge my weapon, but I had to use my communication skills, almost on a daily basis. So you could make the argument that we need to spend a lot more time, not necessarily at the expense of other kinds of training, but we need to spend more time teaching police officers how to come across as non-threatening, genuine, respectful, and, achieve the goal you want. Now, you can employ all these behaviors with great skill and ability and still encounter, a mentally disturbed person or someone up on drugs, and you may not achieve the goal you want, but it's more likely to help you achieve the goal when you do the things that I've just described.
So I'm not sure that policing is the same as it was 20, 30 years ago. It may be that it was just, obey us or would take you to jail. But now, do you believe that there's a bigger social component in law enforcement these days?
Historically, if you look at it in a pretty simplified way, as police officers say, listen, I'm representing the law, I have authority, I'm telling you to do something, and I've asked you to do it, and you're now not doing it, so now I go to the next level, which is my force card. And today we recognize that there's a whole bunch of space between those extremes of doing nothing and then physically, violently overreacting. So good police officers appreciate that. I mean, you should use the level of force necessary that's required by the circumstances. We always used to say in the business of negotiations that the person that determines the outcome is the perpetrator, their behavior. But what we've also learned is we can greatly influence that behavior and gain their cooperation if we employ effective communication skills. And that's an area where, I certainly would like to see police officers receive more training in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I read an article recently about the disparity in the training that, they talked about one particular county, and they talked about the length of time someone was in, weapons training versus de-escalation or communication techniques. I think it was maybe 8 hours or like 1 day of that type of training versus, weeks of force training. So do you think that, it's obvious that you're thinking that reversing that or maybe even equalizing it a bit can have a real-world relevant impact?
Well, the most critical thing a police officer, the most critical thing a police officer ever has to do is use deadly force. So I'm not suggesting for a moment that the level of training and skill required to do that, in an appropriate way should be minimized or reduced or disregarded in any way. I'm just suggesting that on the other end of the spectrum, we probably have historically undervalued, underappreciated, and underdevoted time and energy to teaching these critical communication skills. Because it's not just how does an officer now engage in a manner that de-escalates a conflict, when maybe our thinking should precede that. How does an officer approach a situation and conduct him or herself in a manner that tends to avoid the escalation arising? A lot of times, the officers aren't intentionally trying to do something to make it worse, but, the mere presence of a police unit, lights and sirens, uniforms, it can have a very large impact on the response you get from the community. And that's why that, we all know about the emphasis over the last quite some years that community policing has become an issue that more and more departments have come to realize is an important component. We don't want to just interact with the citizens, once a night when we drive through their neighborhood, but rather we want that officer knowing the people and gaining their trust and confidence that, he's a responsible individual who is interested in their problems and their issues and is someone they will turn to in a time of trouble. And that's, I think the value of that speaks for itself.
Comment here. I've had the privilege of doing some training with our local law enforcement here in Colorado. And Colorado is an open carry state. Citizens are allowed to carry a gun as long as it's in plain view, and they're allowed to have that weapon. There are also a tremendous amount of concealed carry permits issued to citizens that pass the background check. Now, we went into a training one day, and I was playing the bad guy, and we were dealing with an open carry situation and somebody who was very upset. And I did everything I could to push their buttons. And I will say this, our local law enforcement has had a tremendous amount of training with really listening to people and trying to get to the root of the problem, see why they're upset, and not knee-jerk react. So I think there is, in some areas, and I'm sure this is not an isolated training taking place, I think in some areas that training is improving, and those listening skills and communication skills are really being pushed. And I did everything I could to push their buttons, to rattle them, and was really intense. And they reacted very calmly. And I've also seen them out on the street. I've had the privilege of riding with some of them, and they've reacted the same way. So I think that training is improving, and we are getting somewhere, but it's beginning steps. I mean, I think we need to really keep ramping that up.
Well, that's very nice to hear, and I certainly was not suggesting that these skills aren't taught and employed, in many departments around the country. But it is it's not a consistent thing. As you know, the history of law enforcement in the United States is that, unlike some of our European country friends, that we don't have a single police force. We have literally tens of thousands of them, state, local, county, federal agencies, and the level of training and the focus on communication skills and other skill sets for police officers varies enormously. And I'm just suggesting, and of course I've been retired for a while, but I would say that overall in law enforcement, my anecdotal impression is that we have not devoted sufficient time in this, at least in the past, and I'm very delighted to hear that, at least in your locality, that seems to be being embraced and employed effectively.
I agree, except that I do want to stress that I think that we have a very long ways to go. That training needs to be more consistent across the board, as you mentioned, and that's very difficult to do when we have all these individual police departments. I'm just trying to suggest that maybe they're getting to a starting point of that, but I think we have an incredibly long ways to go. So it's very important to me when I work with students as criminal justice majors that they learn the importance of these communication skills and the listening skills. It's critical. Well, I agree, and I also think the public will demand it. I mean, historically, when I was telling someone a story recently, when I was a young FBI agent, we sort of had carte blanche to deal with situations in the way we felt appropriate, and the public would almost always come down on the side of the police and support what law enforcement did and take our version of the story. Now, with cell phones that are ubiquitous and and scrutiny of police actions in certain situations, I think it's not surprising that there has to be a shift in training to avoid these public relation nightmares where police have, done things that might have been avoided had they taken a more thoughtful approach. That being said, it's a terribly tough job. I really feel for the police officers today, and the problems that they have to face on the street, the drugs and the weapons, and it's a tough job, and we're asking them to do an awful lot. And now we're saying, hey, you need to be a better communicator. Well, they do, but I do it not because society demands it, but because I think it'll help save their lives.
I think if police officers can, engage with citizens in a more positive way, it's more likely to keep them safe so they go home to their families at night. And that's how I look at it.
So, obviously, anyone in law enforcement or in the criminal justice system, you're going to be dealing with people in crisis. So what do you think is, what are some good tips for people who are looking to get into this type of industry or career?
Well, we talked about it. I mean, if you want to be a successful police officer, practically a success in any endeavor that requires human interaction, which is essentially all of them, you want to be a good communicator, and you want to be a good listener and focus in on what the other person is saying and doing, and presenting yourself as not someone there to make their day worse, but to want to understand what they're feeling, what their experience is, how they feel about something, to be a good listener and to be non-emotional yourself. That sort of has an effect on the other person. The old two to tango in terms of an argument. So if only one person's arguing, it's harder to sustain that when the other person's not arguing back. I mean, the way I teach this to negotiators, if you picture in your mind a childhood schoolyard teeter-totter, the high end is emotion. And when the emotions are high on one end of the teeter-totter, rational thought and behavior is low. So the first objective of someone dealing with someone in a crisis is to lower the emotional content. And as, again, you keep that picture of the teeter-totter in your mind, as the emotional side of it comes down, what comes up? Rational thinking and rational behavior. And I think that is an absolute in the human condition that you can't argue against. And you can think of many examples in your own life where something has happened that has upset you and angered you, you've been insulted, wronged in some fashion, and your emotion kicks in. It's probably not the time for you to make the best, most rational decisions about what course of action to take or what response to give. That's why, when you sign a legal document, they've built into the law you have 24 hours to back out of it, things like this, because people tend to make decisions and do things on an emotional level that often leads to regret later on.
So distance is helpful.
Well, that's part of the reason I titled my book Stalling for Time, is because if you do nothing else, buy time. Time in and of itself has a tendency to cool off high emotion and to allow the person who is behaving badly to expend that energy and start to think a little bit more clearly. And then as a communicator, as a negotiator, you can, again, insist that you can assist that and improve upon it by your demeanor. I've seen it in the field so many times where a good, calm negotiator can, with great skill, help someone become less aggressive and less argumentative. And you do that by listening to them. A lot of these people that are acting out on confrontation with police, they have problems and issues in their lives, and they feel like nobody understands them, nobody's listened to them, nobody pays them respect. They may have had prior interaction with law enforcement that was less than satisfactory from their point of view. So all of a sudden, instead of this commanding Jack Webb, dragnet kind of officer voice deals with them, now all of a sudden they've got somebody that's, not throwing their rank or authority. They're saying, hey, my name's Bob. I'm with the police, and, I want to help you. What's going on? What happened today? Tell me. And it's disarming to them a little bit, but disarming in a very good way, because they're saying, well, this guy's, he's not what I expected. He's thoughtful and personable, and, I like that.
So do you think that open-ended questions really nurture the conversation and help people reduce that emotional response?
Well, absolutely. I mean, using open-ended questions is one of the active listening skills that are taught to negotiators, and I think that is a particularly good one. Our job is to find out information. Our job is not to show up and tell them all about me and my law enforcement career and how I look at the situation. I want to know how they view it. How do they see this? What happened to them and how they feel about it? And I understand you're threatening your boss there, and you're mad at him because you got fired, and you don't think he appreciates the hard work you've done for this company. For that person hearing you say that, paraphrasing in your words what you think you've heard him say about his situation and how he feels about it, is a very powerful communication tool. This person might say, "Yeah, damn right, that's how I feel." Or, "You're the first one that understands what I'm going through." And that's a pathway to creating a relationship of trust. Again, anybody that tells you they can be successful on all of these things 100% of the time is exaggerating a bit. But again, the employment of these kinds of approaches, are well documented to lead to better results. And again, for me, every time an officer doesn't have to get in a fight on the street or be in a shootout or car chase or whatever it might be, that's an officer that's going to go home that night. And that's really what I care about the most.
Well, certainly in an era of body cameras and cell phones, and everyone whips out their phone now to record an interaction. I guess it's becoming easier to see where the gaps are in terms of the ability to communicate, to listen, have some empathy, and some emotional restraint. So do you think...
I think that's right. And we've seen some egregious cases. But we've also seen, at least in my opinion, some cases where I think officers have acted very reasonably based on the threat, and the public may not appreciate that threat. And there have been some incidents where I believe that the criticism of the police has been unwarranted and based on a lack of knowledge about the difficult situation these officers are in. So there has to be a balance to all this. And, accountability is certainly, as a public servant, you should expect to be accountable and to have your actions meet standards of behavior and conduct. It's not an easy job, but it's the job they took on, and you've got to make sure that you don't lose your cool, as it were, and become violent in situations that simply do not warrant that kind of response. It's hard. It's easy to say and hard to do, but police officers are put in some pretty bad situations.
Well, I think recently there was a police officer in New York who essentially held off, 5 or 6 homeless folks who were fighting with him. And I saw the video, and it was really, I was thinking, wow, so now this was an officer who had also been in the military and had lots of experience, so perhaps his restraint was due to his training. So he was able to kind of keep the people who were attacking him at a distance while still protecting himself and protecting others without pulling his firearm. So obviously each situation is different. Obviously there's no way to know whether, someone's armed or not, but it really got me thinking about how perhaps law enforcement approaches a situation instead of
I'm not
ask
familiar.
Questions later.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that incident. But I know even when I started my FBI career back in the 70s, we used to say, we're going to go try to arrest this bad guy. And you know what? If he gets away, we'll get him another day. It's not worth doing something reckless. And, a lot of police departments make police back off of a high-speed chase because there's been so many instances where, chasing this perpetrator causes him to run through stoplights and stop signs and end up killing innocent people. So is it that important that we arrest this guy for his, 37 unpaid tickets and his, domestic violence charge against his girlfriend? Okay, we'll get him later. We don't need to jeopardize citizens. So it's creating a more thoughtful approach, and there's judgment. The problem is there's judgments that have to be made. And in the height of a critical situation, in my book, I start one of the chapters with a partial quote from Rudyard Kipling that I absolutely love, and I think it applies to so many areas of life. And it's basically, if you can keep your head about you when all else are losing theirs, and blaming you. I mean, it's a great quote, because what makes a good police officer, a trauma surgeon, test pilot, military guy, whatever, is someone that can keep their head about them in a very challenging situation, and that enables them, more likely than not, to make the best decision that they can in a difficult, challenging situation for which there is no easy solution or decision-making choice.
Well, certainly in law enforcement and in criminal justice, you got people's lives in your hands, so it's certainly a good idea to develop those communication skills so that it makes perhaps your job a little easier, and dealing with the public increases that level of trust.
In all of life, and particularly in law enforcement, the ultimate goal is cooperation. We want a cooperation from a witness. We want a cooperation from a victim. We want a cooperation from, somebody who can help us in an investigation. And we want cooperation from a perpetrator, hostage taker, whatever it might be. So if you look at cooperation being the ultimate goal, then you work backward from that. How do we get that cooperation? What's the formula that leads us to get to that point? And it's about building some influence over the person, and doing that through establishing some rapport. And you get that rapport by demonstrating some empathy, and you get the empathy by using some active listening skills. So it's what we call the behavioral change stairway that I developed in the FBI, back in the 90s. Not as a strict model, but as sort of a graphic way to explain it's a process. And the more tense the situation, the more thoughtfully one has to progress up these levels of the stairway to achieve that cooperation. You don't just show up at a hostage situation and say, Mr. Smith, killing your boss isn't going to get you your job back, so quit behaving like a jerk and surrender now. Well, what you've said is probably true, and it's no doubt in his best interest, but I suspect that he's not going to hear those words and say, oh, you're right, I never thought about it that way, and here I come out. So we go back to the teeter-totter. I got to first work through all this emotional stuff and demonstrate that I don't want to see him hurt, and then I'm genuine, I respect him, I'm not going to mistreat him, and all these sorts of things that are relationship-enhancing, building tools that are the most likely pathway to gain cooperation.
Something that I've seen very effective in working with highly emotional people or even mentally ill. My husband is a psychotherapist. He's retired now, but he would go into a very volatile situation, and of course they would think, oh, he's coming with the pen. He's gonna put me on a 72-hour hold or whatever. And he'd go in and say, hey, what's going on today? Are you hungry? Do you need a sandwich? And they're like, what? So if you can throw that curveball, throw them something that says, hey, I care. Let's deal with some what your need is first, like Gary said. And I believe, Gary, I heard you say something very similar in your book. I thought I remembered a situation, it's been a few months, but where you did the exact same thing. And it's very effective if somebody has the impression that they don't expect. Yeah, exactly. They
expect a different – they have a sense of what's going to happen in this interaction, and you present them with something they don't expect. And it throws them off, but in a good way. And it gives you a chance to move out of your official persona and demonstrate that you're a human being, and you care about them. And, that's what happens. And we find this happens a lot with hostage negotiators. They'll resolve a situation, and the perpetrator actually ends up, having good feelings towards the negotiator. He's a really nice guy. We've even had repeat business from some of them. Is Charlie the negotiator working today? I feel I need to talk to him again. So, that's a testimony to the quality of the effort. But it's I think this is not just a law enforcement thing. This works in conflicts within your family, your spouse, and your children, and everything. And I'm sitting here like I'm this great guru on this, and I fail at it all the time. I'm sure my wife would attest, but that's still the goal. When we're communicating, we want to say, hey, it's not all my frame of reference and what I want, what I'm trying to accomplish. I want to know what you're feeling and how you look at this and what's important to you. Because at the end of the day, that's all that really counts, is how the other individual perceives the situation. And only when we can demonstrate that we understand it and we appreciate it, doesn't mean we agree with it, but we appreciate their point of view. Once we've demonstrated that, that's the only way that we're going to achieve the level of cooperation that's going to get this person to say all of a sudden, well, I believe you, thank you for trying to help me, and I'm going to put my gun down and come out, and I trust what you said, that you guys aren't going to beat me up or whatever it might be. People take those actions because they believe the negotiator. And a tidbit that's really interesting is we used to be in the habit of interviewing perpetrators once they would surrender in hostage situations. And, you're trying to learn what was effective in the negotiations and what wasn't. And so we would ask them the question, what was it that the negotiator said that made you come out? And the answer is quite interesting, and it's almost universal across the board. And it would be, I don't recall what you said, but I like the way you said it. Think about that.
Yeah.
It's really heavy. So it's not just, we tend in law enforcement and military and other occupations, we think about the specific deal that we've offered or the words that we say, when in reality, how do we come across? How are we perceived? Is our voice tone correct? If it's a face-to-face situation, is our body language reflect what we want it to? All of these things are vital pieces of the communication process. And, when we first started getting that feedback, I said, wow, you stop to think about it. They have no idea what you said, but they like the way you said it. Right. And, it's like meeting someone at a social function. You go to somebody's house and 10 couples there, and you meet a new couple. You've not met them before, and you find yourself in the kitchen talking to them, making a drink, and next thing you know, you come home and you tell your spouse, I met so-and-so tonight, and what a nice person. And your spouse might say, well, what did you like about him? You might have a difficult time articulating what the specifics were, but you came away with a general impression of someone that you liked and maybe you should engage with more. Let's have them over to dinner. Let's go see a movie or play cards, whatever it might be. And when you think about the universality of that, it's pretty interesting.
So people connect to the emotion behind the words, not specifically the words themselves.
I mean, I see it in our current political discourse, which is, I don't have to tell you, is pretty polarized and pretty bad. And I see things on social media where both sides are quite nasty to each other. And then in reality, when somebody that holds a very different political view from you is with you personally in a social setting, you both instinctively try to avoid that level of acrimony. Not 100% of the time, but more often than not. Right. Because you realize face-to-face here, well, I've got a friendship here that I don't want to ruin, and I've got to give the other person the benefit of the doubt, to listen to them and hear what they have to say. So, I mean, that tells you something right there, and it's one of the dangers of anonymous verbal assaults on each other. When you really sit down face-to-face, it is basically to the benefit of human beings through evolution to cooperate. So you start off with great potential, so you just have to avoid those things that are impediments to cooperation.
So it sounds like we all, no matter our industry, need to improve our listening skills. It makes all the difference in how connected someone feels to you, and it allows you to understand what's going on with them.
Well, Stephen Covey said it best, first seek to understand, then to be understood. So you should take the initiatives to listen and understand somebody else's point of view before you say, well, let me give you my take on it. Because if you start off aggressively talking about what you see, what you want, and we all do it from time to time, but it tends to say, well, I don't really care what you think. I'm telling you the way it is,
Right.
This is a whole different conversation, but I think social media has aggravated that somewhat, where people think, okay, I'm going to put my opinion out there, and who cares what everybody else thinks? And you see a lot of that now, where there's just this lack of general empathy or caring for what other people think. And I think we really need to get back to that and find out what other people need, what they want, what they think, and what their point of view is, and try to understand that, put ourselves in their shoes. And I think that's critically important for law enforcement, but I also think it's very important for citizens in general, because communication is a two-way street. It's not all on the officer. It's not all on the citizen. It's a two-way street. And I just think that's very critical, that we all learn to listen better and we all learn to have some empathy, rather than be in such a hurry to put our own opinion out there.
I'm glad you said that. When you think quickly of a law enforcement context, there's probably communities of this country that would be well served to have in their school system, here's how you engage with a police officer,
Really
educate
true.
the citizenry. Like, you don't see it from the police officer's point of view. So when you're approached because of this, that, or whatever, here's the way you may want to act and here's the way you may not want to act, that's going to more likely achieve the outcome that is beneficial for all. So it is a two-way street, and police officers react to, somebody calling them names and threatening them and doing things. It takes a lot of restraint, and they're human beings, and they get angry, and, they don't like being verbally assaulted or disrespected more than anybody else does. And when you throw in that the authority to take some action about it, it can be a recipe for problems. So people have to be aware of the fact that, even if I don't think I was speeding, this officer's pulled me over, so I've got to be very respectful in how I respond to him or her, or else this may not accrue to my benefit.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful to have school training in communication. I mean, it is such a vital part of life, career-wise, family-wise, personal-wise, because there are instances where people are approached by law enforcement that may not be as professional, might be perceived as insulting or things like that. So again, it does take two to do it. So if you respond in kind, you've just upped the ante for that interaction as well. It would be nice if we were all able to take a step back and calm down and respond appropriately, but it's not always the case.
We all have issues that, raise our blood pressure quickly and, enlist our anger, but, you have to learn to try to control that. Is this going to be to my benefit or not? Am I, chopping my nose off to spite my face? I mean, Exactly.
Are you trying to make a point, or are you trying to get home?
Yeah, exactly. And in the midst of a confrontation, again, I go back to what I said earlier. People may not be thinking and behaving in a clear way, and that's important. And not only the officer behave in a way that doesn't make that worse, but if I was given training to John Q. Citizen, I would say, here's some ways that you can give that police officer reassurance that you're not a threat to him or her, and you're not a problem, and you are cooperating, and you're more likely to get the benefit of the doubt that way. If you engage in these negative activities, this is going to get worse rather than better. Right.
Well, I know that listening to somebody for 3 minutes can seem like an eternity, but the idea is that 3 minutes is not a lot of time, and you can use that time to really bring a situation to a peaceful resolution.
Yeah. A lot of the tough ones, and you touched on it before, you got somebody that's, delusional and's got some serious psychotic problems, saying I'm going to listen to them could become an all-day long affair.
Right, exactly.
With no logical point or end game. So, that becomes very, very difficult. In those cases when an immediate threat is not available, that's when, if the resources are available, police should try to get the mental health folks to come in and get this person what they need, which is treatment, and not a night behind the bars, So, again, some situations are just sad and tragic, and we just put police officers in a really tough position, and I don't think police officers are should be expected to be mental health counselors or substitutes for mental health facilities. But obviously, enhanced training can certainly make them more successful at doing the job we want them all to do. And again, I'll go back, as I have before, to get them so they go home to their families at night. That's what I want.
Absolutely. So hopefully these types of techniques and these skills will yield fewer use of force incidents and just in general improve dialogue between people.
One last thing is, years ago I worked with the police department in Florida. I won't name the department, that decided to literally train every one of its police officers in negotiations. And their SWAT team call-outs reduced by 75%.
Wow.
And what does that tell you? I mean, it tells you that by expending the time and effort to give these police officers enhanced verbal skills, they were able to resolve these field conflicts that otherwise might have escalated to the point where you had to bring in a whole tactical team to, make an entry and arrest somebody. So, I mean, to me, that says an awful lot.
And if you can look at numbers like that, and you could see the benefit of it, I think it would become more widespread. A bit more emphasis might be placed on it. You'd be more effective as a law enforcement community. So I'm all for it.
I think we're all in agreement.
Yes, absolutely.
Check out Gary's website at Gary Noesner, NOESNER.com. And check out his book, Stalling for Time, My Life as a Hostage Negotiator. It's available on Amazon.com, and it's a wonderful read as well as a real thought-provoking book. So hope you'll check it out. Gary, it's a pleasure to see you again. Thank you both for your time.
Thank you.